I therefore invite Her Majesty the Queen to unveil the memorial and the Dean and the Archbishop to dedicate the roof and vault of the restored South Transept.
Canon Ralph Mayland, Canon Treasurer of York Minster, heralds the final act of royal ceremonial. 4 years of unremitting work by Minster staff have turned disaster into triumph and made a masterpiece out of a ruin. Christians in York are no strangers to demolition by fire. When the roof of the Minster's South Transept was struck by lightning on a July night in 1984, it was the 10th time since the Dark Ages that a church on this site had gone up in flames. As dawn broke, for the 10th time, a congregation found its place of worship open to the sky. An adornment familiar to 17 generations lay in ruins.
Oh, it was very emotional, really. I didn't cry, but I mean, you could have done, really, to see this. But I think the thing that comes out is the determination, not only of myself, but of everybody, to get on and restore it and prove that we can still do this kind of work. We're all full of our admiration, all the practical men anyhow, full of admiration for the building and the people who built it, the workmanship that went into it. And so obviously you try to emulate that and to recreate it.
When I walked in here, I was totally alone. At least, I may not have been. There may have been a few people with me. Bob Littlewood may have been with me. I felt alone as I walked in. I knew that Bob Littlewood and his team would do it. I didn't think they'd do it so quickly, but I knew they'd do it just as beautifully. And I said to them then that it wouldn't be long before it was restored to its full glory.
When disaster strikes a national treasure like York Minster, the sense of obligation to craftsmen long dead is a great energizer.
There's a tendency to run away in a corner and try and forget the thing that's happened, but like as a child falling off a bicycle, the best thing is to get on and start pedaling, and so instantly we started to do something. A plan, of course, had to be drawn up, and you could also appreciate there was no shortage of advice as to what we were to do from the outside world. And we did consider all ideas. We had to report to the Dean and Chapter on everything from leaving it as an open ruin to putting it back exactly as it was, or with modifications, same materials, and so on. It took a long time, this discussion. It seemed endless, but within 6 months, everybody had been consulted and the solution had evolved.
The solution was to keep faith with the materials of the past. Not steel and concrete spanning the stricken South Transept, but English oak. It was a choice which workmen on this plot, going back to Roman times, would have had no difficulty with. Ever since then, exceptional buildings have stood here. The Roman road at the eastern end of the Minster once echoed to the tramp of the 6th Legion, whose northern headquarters covered 50 acres where the medieval city and the Minster were to rise 1,000 years on. The barrack buildings, housing more than 5,000 heavy infantry, must have dominated York in 100 AD, as their successor does today. Roman York followed a grid pattern that can still be seen. The mould was broken by the Normans, who ignored the Roman precedent and set their cathedral at an angle of 45 degrees to the square, a departure which the Minster's architects were later to copy exactly. They also followed the Norman design, so the south transept, jutting out from the side of the nave, combines with the transept on the other side to form a cross. Archaeology has uncovered many secrets here. While the Minster's foundations can still yield up a Roman column, there is not a trace of the Saxon church which came later. But we know it existed, and in the eastern crypt, the man who built it, so the Venerable Bede tells us, is commemorated above the font. Edwin, the pagan king of Northumbria, was converted to Christianity in 627 and was baptized in a little wooden church he had built somewhere, we don't know exactly, on this site. One reason was that he'd married a Christian princess from Kent, but Bede gives us a hint of deeper promptings. He says that Edwin was told a parable of a sparrow flying in from a winter storm to enjoy briefly the warmth and light of a king's banqueting hall, then out again into the stormy darkness. The allegory of man's fleeting earthly existence turned the unbelieving king into a Christian and established the unbroken chain of church buildings which culminated in the Minster. Saxon buildings may have crumbled to nothing, but the Dark Ages have left other relics which evoke that mysterious and barely recorded time. Gravestones from the 9th century, discovered only recently during restoration, reveal the wild imaginings of Saxon sculptors, honouring their dead with sinister artistry. Dominating them is the Doom Stone, found 6 feet down alongside the Minster. Also below ground, there's evidence of what every Saxon left behind, and even a glimpse of the vexations of a gravedigger.
At that time, the whole site was turned over to the use of a cemetery, of a graveyard, which I believe was defined by some of the still standing walls of the Roman building. The level of the ground at the time, the middle of the 9th century, was about here, just above the top of the column base itself. These two drums standing on top of this base here would not have been there. And one of the graves we found, with the skeleton had been packed in charcoal, the gravedigger must have had a rather hard time of it. What he did not realise was that what he was having to cut through was actually the side of a Roman column. And there we have the damage that the Anglo-Saxon gravedigger made on that piece of Roman masonry.
When York Minster came to be built in the 13th century, it engulfed and enlarged upon the existing Norman cathedral, whose foundations were far superior to the Minster's, as recent discoveries have shown. The first Norman Archbishop of York, Thomas of Bayeux, had at his disposal a group of brilliant engineers when he began work in 1070. The medieval builders who came after used parts of the Norman foundations in amongst their own ill-assorted patchwork of other people's leftovers. The Norman building was striking enough to leave one wondering why it was felt necessary to improve on it. It was 122 yards long and built of old Roman stone, stucco to keep the rain out of the joints. Little was known of the Norman achievement till archaeologist Derek Phillips investigated the foundations during repair work in the early 70s. It was here that he found not only architectural bygones, but human ones.
This was the part of the great Anglo-Saxon cemetery that filled the ruins of the old Roman headquarters. And when we were digging here to clear this area for the engineers, we came across the graves of that cemetery. And these graves, curiously enough, were not aligned on an east-west alignment as you normally find in churchyard burials or burials associated with churches. That is, in that direction, but they were aligned in this direction, parallel with the axis of the Roman fortress. In this little area, we were really rather pressured at the time because there was great concern specifically about the pier of the central tower, which is just behind us here. And that was settling rather fast, only millimetres per week, but that's quite a lot for a major structure. And so I was given the brief that we had to clear this area of soil. That means from way above our heads right down to below our feet in about 3 days. Bodies are difficult. I think most archaeologists groan a little when they come across human skeletons because they're very complicated when you think of all the bones and fingers and so on, all of which need to be cleaned rather carefully for record purposes. It so happened that when we had finished the work, we found that we'd discovered about 70 Anglo-Saxon skeletons, and some of them were really quite interesting, and some had been laid in iron-bound wooden coffins, which were of great interest in themselves, so we had to work really rather fast.
Not only down in the depths has archaeology moved on from guesswork to verifiable fact. High in a niche of the South Transept wall stands a Norman column, which was swallowed up when the new minster came to be built round it. Now modern repair work has revealed its 900-year progression from load-bearing prop to walled-up remnant to historical curiosity. Even more obscurely, 45 feet up in the roof space, a fragment of Norman outer wall unravels the mystery of how the old cathedral looked. The aisle, which runs all the way along one side of the minster, is just below this walkway. It was a kind of medieval extension built onto the Norman exterior. And there's the evidence, Norman craftsmanship in a hidden embrace with the later building. This was the right angle where the old Norman transept jutted out from the side of the cathedral, and on part of the wall, proof positive of its astonishing appearance.
The remains of the Norman walls had a skim of plaster, and the outside plaster was whitewashed all over, and on the whitewash, level lines and vertical lines in red paint were picked out to look as if they were stone joints. Now, this is something which, until that discovery here at York, had been very much doubted, and that when, soon after the year 1000, a chronicler wrote of Europe putting on a new white robe of churches, that he was only speaking romantically. It wasn't realized that he was speaking of an actual physical thing that you could see, that these churches were plastered over and whitewashed outside so that they stood up as white buildings in the countryside. The building that size, white all over, must have indeed have been startling, but it was meant to be startling.
The mason's craft goes back way beyond the Normans on these few acres. The signature tune of work in progress here has always been the ring of chisel on stone. In almost 2,000 years of rebuilding and repair, the fire damage of 1984 was just another disaster, with virgin stones from France soon taking their place next to a blackened survivor. Along with all the fresh materials came the appointment of a new dean, a baptism of fire in every sense.
It was not only a challenge, it was something of a shock, because I was comfortably working as Archdeacon of Cleveland, sad about the fire in the Minster, and then suddenly discovered I was going to be invited to take part in repairing it. I think I'm number 74 of the deans, And they've had fires and collapses and catastrophes and rebuilds, of course, right back at almost at the beginning of that list of 74.
Now, how do you combine in your duties the demands of the spiritual life of the Minster and the commercial side?
Well, I personally don't find too much conflict between things which are sometimes called secular and things which are sometimes called religious. I think that's actually a help to have a state of mind where you see people's life as a whole and don't divide it into compartments. But in the Minster, our primary task is to have a place of worship where splendid and grand services take place, where a very high standard of preaching and a very high standard of music is maintained, and making this available nowadays, I'm glad to say, to all the Christians in the north of England. In a sense, it matches what happened in the Middle Ages, in the days when cathedrals, and especially Canterbury and York, were places of pilgrimage and visit. People came here for the day out. Indeed, they came into the Minster and they came to services, some of them, but many of them just came to look at the shrines and to give their devotions there and really to have a good day out.
Catastrophes come and go, but decay is ever present. Unrelated to the fire, the Great West Window of 1338, its heart-shaped tracery under wraps, needs emergency repairs by the Minster's masons, inheritors not only of the window itself, but of skills to match the men who made it.
The Great West Window is our major task at this present time. It was sadly damaged. It had been patched, repaired for 200 years. But the dangerous period had now emerged when it was possible there could be a real collapse. And this was danger not only to the stone, of course, but even more so to the very, very precious original glass put there in the early 14th century. So it had to be a major repair, and we've had to renew most of the intricate, very intricate curved stones. And the skill of our stonemasons in working out these curves, not me, but them, is incredible.
It's all done by hand. The only machinery used, instead of using a mallet and chisel, you use a pneumatic chisel. But the only assistance we have at the beginning of the job is we start from a square block which comes off the saw, whereas originally they would have had to square the block off using a mallet and chisel. So that saves almost a week's work. But still, any one of these might have taken up to 6 weeks to carve nowadays.
During the 150 years the Norman Cathedral stood before its complete remodelling, it had its own share of disasters. The bold geometry of decorated stone in the crypt shows where Archbishop Roger rebuilt the Norman choir after it burned down in 1137. Massive, inanimate, the stonework yet conveys a human message down the ages, a tiny mason's mark, souvenir of one man's part in the great endeavour.
They were built in the 1200s. And the North Transept, as you can see on my right, has got a lovely window, and it's the Five Sisters window. This one is very early medieval, and it's got 100,000 pieces of glass in it. It's made of a greeny-grey glass, grisaille glass, and
the Five Sisters are among the Minster's earliest glass. Stretching skywards for 53 feet, each lancet features a pattern of leaves and fruit, though the breakages and extra leading of many years have made the design increasingly hard to follow. At least the major re-leading in 1925 was done with a fine attention to authenticity. The lead from the 13th century, like the window, had been buried under rubble at Rievaulx Abbey since the dissolution of the monasteries. Trying to puzzle out the intricacies of the Five Sisters is one of the Minster's leading diversions. No single building in England, and few in Europe, can rival York Minster's sheer wealth of medieval glass. Among the greatest glories is the east window. Almost as long and wide as a tennis court, it floods the choir with spectacle and colour. The prodigy who created it in the early 1400s was John Thornton, master glazier of Coventry. Only in the kind of close-up unattainable from the ground can the full detail of Thornton's design be grasped, with its tableau of biblical figures crowding across panel after panel. Even less accessibly, modest John Thornton signed his masterpiece with a monogram high up in the right-hand corner. His fee for the job was modest too, just £55. Happily, the east window is much as it's always been, but not so the rose window of the South Transept.
It's a huge symbol of the House of Tudor. That's what the rose window is. The diameter of the window, 22 feet 4 inches, 73 separate panels of glass. And certainly it was one of the saddest days of my life, going back to the 9th of July 1984, to see this window cracked into something like 40,000 separate pieces.
It was decided that the rose window's every last crack must be repaired. Miraculously, the lead hadn't melted, but the soldered joints had, which made it touch and go whether the 73 panels would hold together as they were lifted out one by one. The melting points of solder and lead are only a few degrees apart, so it was a close-run thing indeed. The first problem was to develop an adhesive strong enough for the job, yet watery enough to seep right down into the hairline cracks. To try to give the rose window another 450 years of life, each pane was wrapped on both sides in a protective sandwich of clear glass. Once the lead and glass were in place, the panels were prepared for the final process. With the soldering of the joints, the jigsaw was complete.
We've done our best to salvage the glass, and now it's back, the Tudor glass, shattered into thousands of pieces, sandwiched between two layers of glass. So that particular glass is not going to weather over the ages like so many other windows in the Minster, so that is an added bonus as far as we're concerned. And that glass now, I would like to think when it is seen and viewed from ground level, it will look just as good as it did before the fire. And so we've kept faith, I would like to think, with the medieval craftsmen who created this window way back in the early part of the 16th century. We have ensured that their work, damaged as it was in the fire, lives on for future generations.
Coping with an actual disaster while trying to avert the next one is not the whole of life for a master glazier. There's room for a little frivolity now and again.
On the south side of the Zeus Chapel are two windows. And now those two windows are entirely, shall we say, new windows to York Minster. They did not exist a few years ago. But during the post-war restoration of the Minster glass, one of my jobs was where if we came across a little bird or a little animal in a completely misplaced position, In any Minster window, it was my job to take it out, put them on one side, always intending when we had sufficient pieces of glass gathered together, we would make 2 new windows for the Minster. Well, it took 15 years to collect all those pieces of glass together. And one piece of glass which everyone seems to love, in fact, is a little wren chasing a spider. Now, no one knew that glass existed 30 years ago. I found it in a window in the nave, covered with dust and dirt, and it's only 1 1/4 inches in length. That's all it is. Their work, those medieval craftsmen, worked for the glory of God. And when you see the detail of the glass at eye level, you realize that their work, whether it was at ground level or 80 feet above the ground, they put as much work and thought and detail into the painting of the glass just as though it was always going to be seen at eye level. And that's not a bad lesson to us in the 20th century.
In the early 1200s, the Pope described York's Norman Cathedral as greater and more dignified than that at Paris. So what possessed the medieval churchmen who decided to put something even grander in its place? Divine guidance, hopes of salvation, or the sin of pride? Whatever it was, future generations have had much to thank them for. The untold multitudes who've come here and marvelled through the ages owe a debt, whether they realise it or not, to a certain Archbishop Walter de Grey, principal begetter of York Minster. Oxford educated, former Chancellor of England and worldly wise, de Grey arrived in 1215 and imposed order on a turbulent province. And it was that which made possible his noble undertaking, the building of a vast new minster. De Grey's work began where his tomb still stands, in the South Transept, whose restoration after fire is the cause of such rejoicing nearly 8 centuries later. De Grey knew that the work stretched ahead for generations to come, but what did that matter in the eternal scheme of things? It was enough to have shown the way towards the greater glory of God. When De Grey took restoration in 1968,
I have sworn unto David my servant.
among the remains were De Grey's trappings of office, once in daily use.
And by truth in the congregation of the saints.
It was said at the exhumation that the skeleton conveyed a sense of quiet dignity and repose. If ever a man earned his rest, it was Walter de Grey. The South Transept had the lightness of touch which characterized the early English style, and yet was much larger than the Norman transept it replaced. The detailed drawings of a 19th century survey show what masters of design de Grey's craftsmen were.
And to be had in reverence of all them that are round about him. O Lord God of hosts, who is like unto thee? My truth, most mighty Lord, is on every side. Thou rulest the raging of the sea. Thou stillest the waves thereof when they arise. Thou hast subdued Egypt and destroyed it.
The South Transept set the scale for the new minster, which was to occupy church and laity in York for the next 2.5 centuries.
The heavens are thine, the earth also is thine. Thou hast laid the foundation.
In parallel with the work on the South Transept, other less spectacular repairs have been underway on the other side of the minster. The North Transept has been given a completely new covering of lead. Deterioration of the old copper roof made the job urgent, and the Dean and Chapter had to bring in subcontractors. The 50 tons of new lead, worth £35,000, are expected to last a good 100 years. The stripping of the roof has made it possible to guard against fire damage in the future. Just below where the men are working is a trapdoor system, activated by heat, which would give flames an escape route instead of being trapped inside the roof space, thus improving the chances of saving the framework. If the South Transept had had this damage limitation device, its roof structure might not have been destroyed. As it was, straight English oak was needed for a complete rebuild. The job of locating it all over the country fell to Bob Littlewood, Superintendent of Works.
These were the timbers, and there were 56 of these big timbers to find. These were the timbers that were most difficult and had to come through necessity from the large estates where they'd been growing under the ideal conditions. We took the carpentry force, labour force, here at the yard, and we divided into two teams, two foremen, two teams, and one team were working on the vault in the centre of the transept, and the other team were working round the back of the cathedral in a temporary workshop we'd erected in which to build these huge roof trusses, and they were there making these roof trusses.
Many landowners, including the Queen, donated trees for the new vault. Even in a time of crisis, the handing down of trade secrets continues. Working to the specifications of their seniors, new apprentices learn old skills, as they always have.
Now gradually take your saw handle down lower and lower as you go. That's it.
So they're going to do the same on other joints?
Yeah, just keep going through it. If you're sawing an ordinary joint, that's it. That's the way. And saw it a little bit further down now. Just have another check there, because you're running off just a little bit. Can you see it? That's it.
Very little medieval wood carving remains in the Minster. This example, in the St. Nicholas Chapel, has survived the various fires which have destroyed so many masterpieces of the past. In this century, a Yorkshire craftsman has left his signature on the woodwork he created in a way that marks him out from all others. The carved mouse on a screen near the altar identifies the special artistry of Mouse Thompson from Kilburn in the Old North Riding. Another of his church mice cowers at ankle height in the Lady Chapel, unobserved by passing humanity. No trademarks on the new ceiling bosses for the South Transept, but the personal touch nonetheless.
The general theme is given to us by the surveyor of the fabric, and that was from Dean and Chapter, that was the Benedicite from the morning prayer. And then we interpret each verse of the Benedicite according to our own requirements and inclinations. When you're actually working on it, you don't always think, oh, I'm making history. I mean, you just get on and do the job that's required.
The stone carvers of 1270 cast a steely eye over family, friends, and no doubt their lords and masters, and made them unwitting artists' models for the 300 chapter house heads. The octagonal chapter house, next to be built after the transepts, was designed as a spectacular office block for the administrators and staff. It was used by Edward I, Hammer of the Scots, who made York a seat of government during his northern campaigns. The repainted vault shows the Minster's old coat of arms, a Y, alongside its more recent one, a pair of cross keys. By the time the outside of the chapter house was as we see it today, 140 years had passed since work began, an indication of the pace of building when the only power supply was human. Above the elegant stained glass of the vestibule which connects the chapter house to the north transept are more modest windows. They throw barely enough light, you might think, for a function without which none of it would have been possible. This was the mason's drawing office, where the masters of their craft made full-scale mouldings on the plaster floor. From the resulting templates grew their next and yet nobler embellishment, the nave.
It is quite extraordinary. One sees a building of such extraordinary size, and one already knows that it took several centuries to reach the state we see. And the question you ask is, how did they do it? How was it conceivably possible that they could envisage such a thing? And even though it's bit by bit, how could they get there in the end? And by a certain date in 1472, have a dedication service saying, "Let us clap our hands, York Minster is finished." Of course, it wasn't absolutely finished, but for practical purposes, all this was the culmination that started in 1080 when the first Norman cathedral was planned out for Archbishop Thomas of Bayeux. And this went on from 1080 till 1472, nearly 400 years. And if you count 3 generations to a century, you've got 12 human generations had gone by. And in a dozen generations, you have got these people steadily doing their particular jobs, from the master mason down to the meanest hod carrier on the site. And all of them were working on, in a sense, they were working to the glory of God because they believed they were making something particularly splendid for York, for their own diocese, for their own county.
The great work was rounded off with a kingly flourish. The choir screen paid York's respects to royalty.
Down again to where the carved kings of England stand, on the choir screen. And so to the bride.
In 1961, Her Royal Highness the Duchess of Kent, born into a famous Yorkshire family, was married at the Minster.
I think I was rather in daze that day. I think I was very overwhelmed myself, actually. I just remember the very long walk I had up the aisle, and my father saying, "Come on, let's start." I remember certain moments of it very clearly. The beauty. And of course, I remember very clearly the light from the television lights lit up everything so beautifully.
Catherine Lucy Mary.
Take thee, Edward.
Take thee, Edward.
To my wedded husband.
To my wedded husband.
To have and to hold.
To have and to hold.
From this day forward.
From this day forward.
For better, for worse.
For better, for worse.
For richer, for poorer.
Celebration was soon to be followed by calamity. In the mid-1960s, the central tower was found to be in imminent danger of collapse. There was an awful precedent. It had fallen down once before, in 1407.
See this down here, I've seen him there.
A restoration programme on the scale of the Minster itself was needed, if visitors were to continue to peer at the reflected glory of the vault, with which John Forster, master carpenter, topped off the tower in 1473. The dean and chapter were warned that in a few years' time it would be too late. Unless the foundations were massively reinforced very soon, the cracking of the masonry above and below floor level would so weaken the building that it would never survive the upheaval of restoration. The largest appeal for any ecclesiastical building in England was mounted. The £2 million target was met, and ton upon ton of concrete was inserted into the foundations around the central tower. The huge blocks, reinforced with steel rods binding them to the old masonry, doubled the strength of the 4 pillars on which the tower stands. As a feat of engineering, it's deservedly on permanent display. Here, in a space the size of a living room, you can trace 2,000 years of human achievement. A few feet from the reinforced concrete of today is the kind of jerry building which made it necessary, a jumble of masons' oddments transporting us to 1290 and the suspect underpinnings of the present Minster. Back 2 more centuries, and a glimpse of superior Norman foundations, only discovered in 1968, show us exactly where Thomas of Bayeux built his cathedral. The alignment of the earlier Saxon churches has yet to be found. Perhaps they were too insubstantial to leave their mark. But that could never be said of any work undertaken by the Romans. Nearly 20 centuries away in time, but no distance in space, is an outer wall of the old Roman barracks. Inside it lived and worked the colonial functionaries who ran the whole of the northern province of Roman Britain. So the excavations of the 1970s, with all their great cost and anxiety, yielded many riches. Roman paintings and artifacts emerged from their time capsule below ground to breathe life into the story of a building site. First, the Minster, most enduring of all the structures that have stood here, gives way to its Norman predecessor. As we move back further, time strips away Norman extensions and renewals to reach the creation of Thomas of Bayeux, soon after the conquest. Then the time machine whisks us through the Saxon centuries, back to the very earliest wooden church of King Edwin. And so finally to the first known occupants, the Romans. With their vast headquarters building, they began the sequence which has given this favoured spot a place in the hearts of every generation since. Reverting to forward progression, the march of time is signalled by the clock in the North Transept, the responsibility for nearly 90 years of 3 generations of the Newey family. Jeff Newey will soon clock up his half-century as winder and mechanic for this and other timepieces around York. At one point in its 200-year history, the clock was over the door of the South Transept. So the door could be opened, the pendulum was ingeniously sited not underneath, but to one side of the mechanism. Every time he winds the clock, Jeff Newey sees the family name in brass, commemorating the restoration undertaken by his grandfather in 1928.
Of course, grandfather started here probably about the turn of the century, and then father, he did it, and of course I've been doing it since I started work. In 1928, the original chime part must have worn out, and my grandfather designed this new one, putting all the new parts on this frame here, which is quite a clever bit of design work. A lot of years ago, someone must have worked out that that it takes the choir 3 minutes to go in procession from the south choir aisle into either the choir or the nave, and so these chimes were put in to chime at 3 minutes to the hour to let for the choir to start off, and then they arrive at the correct time for the service to start at exactly the hour when the 2 jacks go.
klaxon horns connected with our fire protection system will be tested. Will you please note this is purely a test. There is no need to evacuate the Minster.
Minster 1 to 1, come in, Alex.
Minster 1 to Minster 1, in position.
With more than 1,000 years behind them of fire by arson, accident and lightning strike, the Minster staff have turned this last experience to advantage by installing new preventive devices. The equipment they're testing puts them directly in touch with the emergency services. Also recently installed is a system which links all the lightning conductors on the towers and pinnacles of the Minster. So the next time one of them is struck, the phenomenon known as side flash, thought to have caused the 1984 fire, will be avoided. Across the road from the east end of the Minster are the chapter offices in St William's College, administrative headquarters of the Minster, run by the chapter clerk, Major General Keith Birch. When he arrived soon after the fire, it was a time not only of crisis, but of change.
In modern terms, it's really chief executive of the Minster, and although there's been a chapter clerk since the year 1201, in the past it has been largely concerned with legal affairs. But now, with the volume of business that we do, not only worship, but tourism and many other facets of administration, it was necessary to set up a sort of chief executive system, which is what I do. There is clearly a need for balance between the various elements of the Minster, and the three main elements really are worship and the development of worship, tourism and the development of tourism, and the maintenance and preservation of the fabric of the Minster. So those are the three elements which the Dean and Chapter try to get the balance right, and although the balance will possibly vary from time to time depending on priorities at that time. We have well over 2 million visitors a year, and we therefore have to have a very large tourist department to handle the sheer volume of people and to handle those things which people go to, for example, visiting the chapter house, the undercroft and so on, and those elements which involve money, like the bookshop and that sort of thing.
Catering for the emergence of mass tourism, General Birch's small army of guides, information officers, vergers and flower ladies also includes the security force, which is about to descend ever so politely on the lone busker. The argument is, broadly, that once you tolerate the odd guitarist, in no time you've got a full-size rock group.
Okay, certainly. Yeah.
Okay.
Cheers, mate.
Sorry, you'll have to pack up and move on.
We're better to go over that way.
No, you'll have to go right away from here.
Okay. Certainly. When you're a professional, you've got to go wherever you like, don't you? It's all right, love, the stop with me.
A year after the fire, already the new roof takes shape, thanks to technology.
The vault itself had to have seasoned timber. So here we devised a means of laminating the ribs together and the bosses, that is, having the trees sawn into planks of 3.5 inches thick. We had them air dried for 9 months to a year and then kiln dried for a further 3 months. We took those planks then and we sawed them to the various curves that we require for the vault. And of course there are about 5 or 6 different curves to the ribs here of the vaulted ceiling. All that we had really to work from was a few old photographs of that vault, no drawings, nothing like that. We also have to take into consideration the variances in the building, the fact that the walls are bowed and are out of level with each other. No two ribs are the same length. They all meet into the bosses at different angles. So it's a matter of fitting and fitting again until you get the correct lengths and the correct angles of all the ribs. So it is a very long, lengthy process.
But not by some standards. A modern craftsman might find it hard to share the long perspective of his medieval counterpart. A man could spend half the 14th century building York Minster, with 100 years completed before he even began, and another 100 to go after he closed his innings. But some things don't change, like family tradition. Bob Littlewood's grandfather, father, mother and uncle worked at the Minster, and now his son has joined him.
My grandchildren already regard it as my church, you know, they talk about it as my church. And I think, you know, I hope that they will look at photographs in years to come of myself and others who have done this work, you know, and look on it with pride.
A recurring theme in the story of the Minster has been the refusal of its long line of administrators to give in before the ravages of fire and collapse. Some of it could have been avoided, some not. But whenever disaster has struck, the clergy and people of York have picked up the pieces, literally, and started again. When the Minster was completed on the 3rd of July 1472, it had taken 2.5 centuries to build. It's as if something begun in the reign of George II had only been finished yesterday. Those like Walter de Grey, who embarked on the great adventure in 1220, felt themselves part of a continuous thread of Christian endeavour, stretching towards eternity. That's what launched them on a task they could never hope to see ended. And that's what inspired the great restoration of our own times.
Bob, how nice to see you again.
Nice.
I don't know how to congratulate you. 4 years.
Thank you.
It's really
It
remarkable.
has been, yes.
But then I felt that day 4 years ago, 2 days after the fire. Do you remember when I came
Yes,
up?
I do remember.
The feeling of emotion, do you remember? But you've managed even to get the scars of the fire away. There's nothing left to see.
We've changed the whole of the end rising around the rose window, which previously was a hopscotch
really?
of wrongly shaped
So it's
ribs.
actually even better than it was before.
I'd like to think
Oh,
so.
it is.
Yes.
I do assure you it is. And he's the man, with Charles Brown, responsible for that.
One would not wish to have such a great opportunity necessarily presented to one, but one has the opportunity to be in, as it were, a kind of relay race. For a short time, you carry the baton of responsibility, and with this marvelous team we have here, you take what opportunities are given to secure the preservation of this great building, which, in its way, is a symbol of eternity.
A concept which no master craftsman on the original ceiling would have had any difficulty in accepting. He would not have known the Benedicite on which the new ceiling bosses are based, but its sentiments would have been his exactly. O all ye works of the Lord, bless ye the Lord, praise him and magnify him forever.
Here we are, this beautiful new ceiling. The last time I looked up at it, it was sky. Again, the day I came up, it was a very moving day. Everybody I talked to would come rushing in, having heard the 7 o'clock news that York Minster was on fire. They all felt that they weren't anymore just doing a job as a stonemason here or a glazier here or whatever it was, but they were actually working in the house of God. And that they were determined to bring it back to its full glory. And I think a lot of the workforce here would agree with me then that the shock of the fire made a lot of us who loved this place realize that it was a house of God. It really was somewhere very special.
the aid of all that need, the help of all that flee to thee for succour. Open the gate unto us that knock, that this infant may enjoy the everlasting benediction of thy heavenly washing.
A rare baptism in the crypt, made possible because the grandfather is head of the broderers or embroiderers guild at the Minster.
Our Lord. Amen. Now for the moment of truth.
With the South Transept restored, the old ritual celebrates not only the renewal of life and of the Christian faith, but the renewal of York Minster itself.
Name this child.
Andrew Thomas.
Andrew Thomas, I baptize you in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen.